Story 1. The Shadow in the House. I was 20 years old, balancing college life with a part-time job as a babysitter. It wasn't a bad gig. I loved kids, and the families I worked for were always kind. One family, in particular, stood out. They were wealthy, with a sprawling estate that could have easily been mistaken for a mansion. I occasionally nannied for them on weekends, especially when they went on trips. Their 2 children, James and Jessica, were adorable, well-behaved, and full of life. They had their routines, their toys, and their massive bedrooms filled with everything a child could want. It was a chilly autumn evening when I arrived at the house, leaves falling like golden confetti, covering the vast lawn in a shimmering blanket. The parents greeted me warmly as usual, going over the same instructions. Bedtimes at 7:30 for Jessica and 8:30 for James. No friends over, and feel free to use the guest room if I got tired. They left soon after, and I was alone with the kids in the giant house. The house was enormous, almost intimidating with its grand old-world architecture. The kind of house that has seen generations pass through its halls, each one leaving a trace of their presence behind. It had that creaky, lived-in feel, where every step on the wooden floors seemed to echo a little too loudly. But it was also a house filled with warmth, from the large fireplace in the living room that crackled with a comforting glow, to the soft, plush furniture that invited you to sink in and never leave. Despite its size, the house had a way of making you feel at home. Friday night went smoothly. We played games, watched movies, and I even let them stay up a little later than usual. James and Jessica were excited about the weekend, their energy contagious. I tucked Jessica in first, her tiny arms wrapped around a plush unicorn, and then James, who insisted on reading a comic book until he fell asleep. Once they were both soundly asleep, I was free to relax. The family's estate was more like a private resort. A large pond sat in the middle of the property, reflecting the moonlight like a giant mirror. The water was still, so still that it almost seemed unnatural. The trees surrounding the pond stood tall and silent, their leaves barely rustling in the cool night breeze. There was a pool house across the pond, complete with a bar, a pool table, and a massive TV. It was my favorite spot. I made my way there after the kids were asleep, grabbing a snack from the kitchen before settling in to watch a movie. The pool house was quiet, the perfect place to unwind, away from the responsibilities of school and work. As I sat there, munching on popcorn, I couldn't help but think about how lucky I was to have this job. The house, the kids, the freedom, it was all perfect. I was halfway through a comedy when the intercom system crackled to life, startling me out of my seat. The sound echoed through the empty pool house, a harsh reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I walked over to the intercom and pressed the button. Jessica's small, frightened voice came through, saying she was scared because she kept hearing noises. It wasn't unusual for her to have nightmares, so I told her I'd be right over. I hurried back to the main house, the cold air nipping at my face. Entering the code to unlock the door, I quietly made my way to Jessica's room. She was already back in bed, her eyes wide with fear. I sat beside her, stroking her hair until she relaxed. Her little face, usually so full of life, was pale and tense. She clung to her unicorn, her knuckles white as she held on tight. "What kind of noises did you hear, sweetie?" I asked softly, trying to keep my voice calm. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she should tell me. "Scratching," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Like someone scratching on the walls." I glanced around the room, trying to figure out where the sound could have come from. The house was old, and it wasn't unusual for it to make noises, especially at night. But the way Jessica described it sent a chill down my spine. "It's probably just the wind, Or maybe a tree branch, I reassured her. Nothing to worry about. But even as I said it, I didn't fully believe it. The fear in her eyes was too real, too palpable to be dismissed so easily. After a few minutes, she was asleep again, the fear melting away into the soft breaths of a child in dreamland. I left her room, closing the door softly behind me. In the kitchen, I searched for a bottle of wine. I figured a glass might help me relax after the scare. The kitchen was large, with marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances. It was the kind of kitchen you'd see in a magazine, all sleek lines and polished surfaces. But tonight, it felt cold and empty, the shadows in the corners seeming a little too dark. As I was rummaging through the drawers for a corkscrew, I heard a faint creak from the hallway. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. The house was old, and it wasn't unusual for it to make noises, but this was different. It was deliberate, almost like the sound of someone shifting their weight on an old wooden floor. I shook off the unease, convincing myself it was just the house settling. With the wine and corkscrew in hand, I made my way back to the pool house, locking the door behind me. The pool house was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold unease that had begun to settle in my stomach. I tried to lose myself in the movie, but my mind kept wandering back to the noise. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more it gnawed at me. The intercom beeped again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. This time, there was no voice, just the sound of breathing. My mind raced as I pressed the button and called out Jessica's name. Nothing. Just the steady, rhythmic sound of someone breathing on the other end. Panic started to bubble up inside me. I called out for James, but there was still no answer. Only the breathing continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other end wanted me to hear every inhale, every exhale. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of it almost deafening in the silence. I quickly ended the call and grabbed my phone, dialing my friend Kelsey. She answered after a few rings, her voice slurred with alcohol. I tried to explain what was happening, but she just laughed it off, telling me I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe her, to dismiss the growing fear as nothing more than an overactive imagination. But then the hallway lights in the main house turned on, and I knew this wasn't in my head. Through the large window of the pool house, I could see the lights in the house flicker on, one by one, illuminating the long, empty hallways. My breath caught in my throat as a shadow moved across one of the windows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking slowly, deliberately. He stopped at one of the windows and looked out, his face obscured by the darkness. But I knew he was looking at me. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The intercom was still on, and I screamed into it, telling whoever was in the house that I was calling the police. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The operator tried to keep me calm, asking for details, but all I could think about were the kids. Jessica and James were still in the house with that man. As I was talking to the operator, I heard a scream through the intercom, Jessica's voice piercing the silence. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. The operator was trying to get me to focus, to stay calm, but I was losing it. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. The thought of that man hurting the kids was unbearable. Suddenly, Jessica's voice came through the intercom again, shaky and scared, calling my name. I grabbed the mic, my voice trembling as I told her to get James and come outside. She was crying, telling me there was a man in the house. I told her I knew, but she needed to be brave and get her brother. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for them to appear at the door. When I finally saw them, their small figures outlined in the glow of the hallway lights, I ran across the yard to meet them. I grabbed their hands, pulling them back to the pool house. We hid there, lights off, huddled together as I whispered to them that everything would be okay. But I didn't believe my own words. The fear in their eyes mirrored my own, and I struggled to keep it together for their sake. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour, until finally the police arrived. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, and I led the kids to the door. Relief washed over me as I saw the officers approaching. They took the kids to one car while I was escorted to another. More police cars arrived, their lights casting eerie shadows across the lawn. I answered their questions as best I could, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. And then they found him. The man they brought out looked old, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of anger and confusion. His eyes were wild, darting around as they led him to the car in handcuffs. He glanced at me, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. It was a look that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He looked like a man who had lost his mind, like someone who had been broken long ago and never put back together. Jessica and James's parents were called immediately, and arrangements were made for their aunt to come pick them up. I stayed until the police were done, answering more questions, recounting the events over and over until they were satisfied. But when I finally got home that night, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline still coursed through my veins, keeping me awake, my mind replaying the events over and over. The parents were grateful, understanding why I couldn't continue to work for them. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a nightmare. I could only imagine how traumatized the kids must have been. I hoped, with all the resources their parents had, that they would get the help they needed to move past this. But as for me, that night changed everything. The image of that man, his twisted face and wild eyes, haunted my dreams for months. The sound of the intercom beeping, the echo of Jessica's scream, it all played on a loop in my head, a constant reminder of the terror that had invaded what should have been a quiet, uneventful weekend. I never babysat again after that. I couldn't. The fear was too much, the memories too raw. I often wonder what happened to that man, what drove him to terrorize a home full of innocence and joy. But then I remember the look in his eyes, and I realize that some questions are better left unanswered. Years have passed since that night, but the memories are as vivid as ever. Every time I see a house that resembles that mansion, with its grand windows and sprawling lawns, I feel a shiver run down my spine. I moved out of town shortly after the incident, seeking a fresh start in a place where the memories couldn't reach me. But no matter how far I ran, the shadow of that night followed me. I've tried to piece together the man's story, to make sense of why he was there, what he wanted. But there are no easy answers. The police couldn't find much information on him. He was just a drifter, someone who had slipped through the cracks of society. No family, no friends, just a solitary figure wandering the streets until he found his way into that house. The thought of how easily he could have gone unnoticed, how close he came to something far worse, haunts me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear things. A creak in the floorboards, a rustle of leaves outside my window, and for a moment, I'm back in that house, hearing the soft breathing on the other end of the intercom. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that I'm safe now. But the fear never really goes away. It lingers, a dark cloud hanging over me, reminding me that the world is full of shadows, and sometimes those shadows reach out and touch you. I still keep in touch with Jessica and James's parents. They moved not long after the incident, too. The house was sold, and a new family moved in. I've driven by it a few times, but I can't bring myself to stop, to look too closely. What if that man is still out there, watching, waiting? What if he found his way back? The questions swirl in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Jessica and James are older now, but the scars of that night remain. They don't talk about it much, but I can see it in their eyes, the way they glance over their shoulders, the way they avoid dark, empty rooms. We're all survivors of that night, but the experience has left us changed, marked by something we can't fully understand. In the end, I've come to accept that some things in life are beyond explanation. Evil exists, and sometimes it crosses our path for reasons we'll never know. All we can do is face it, survive it, and move on. But the memories, the fear, they never truly leave. They're a part of us, woven into the fabric of our being, a reminder of the night the shadows came to life. Story 2. Whispers in the Woods. It was November, the kind of November where the days lingered in a strange twilight, never fully embracing the warmth of the sun, and the nights descended with a heavy, almost oppressive darkness. I was 28 years old, craving a break from the relentless pace of life in the city, where the concrete and steel pressed in on all sides. I needed space, solitude, and a chance to breathe. So I packed up my gear, loaded my Beagle Reggie into the truck, and headed out to the local woodlands for a weekend of solo camping. The woods were familiar, a place I'd visited many times before. There was something comforting about the way the trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that whispered secrets to the wind. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of decaying leaves, and the ground was littered with a patchwork of orange, yellow, and brown. As I drove deeper into the woods, the signal on my phone flickered and died, leaving me completely disconnected from the world. It was exactly what I wanted. I parked the truck at the edge of the forest and began the mile-long hike to my favorite campsite near the lake. The path was narrow, barely more than a deer trail, winding through the trees and around the occasional boulder. Reggie trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he sniffed at everything in sight. The hike was peaceful, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of a bird taking flight. When I reached the campsite, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. It was a small clearing, nestled between the trees and the edge of the lake, with just enough space for my tent, a fire pit, and a few logs arranged in a rough circle. The lake itself was calm, a mirror reflecting the gray sky above, and the trees on the far side stood like silent sentinels, watching over the water. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the worries of the world could be left behind. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and laid out my supplies. The process was routine by now, each action a familiar rhythm that brought me closer to the solitude I craved. Once everything was in place, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed to the lake, Reggie at my side. The water was cold, but not unbearable, and I cast my line out, hoping to catch something for dinner. As I waited, I found myself staring across the lake, my mind wandering. The far side was dense with trees, a dark wall of foliage that seemed impenetrable. I'd never explored that part of the woods, always sticking to the familiar paths and clearings on this side of the lake. There was something about those woods, though, something that made my skin prickle with unease. It was as if the trees held their breath, waiting for something or someone. Reggie, usually content to sit by my side while I fished, was restless. His ears perked up, and he kept glancing toward the far side of the lake, his tail stiffening. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, his behavior unsettled me. Reggie was a well-trained dog, not prone to barking at shadows or chasing after imaginary creatures. If something had his attention, it was worth paying attention to. After a while, I reeled in my line, deciding that the fish weren't biting today. As I packed up my gear, I noticed movement on the far side of the lake. Two figures, barely more than silhouettes, were walking along the edge of the woods, just visible through the gaps in the trees. They were too far away to make out any details, but something about them seemed off. Their movements were slow, almost deliberate, and they stayed close to the tree line as if trying to remain hidden. I felt a cold nut form in my stomach. It wasn't unusual to see other campers or hikers in the woods, but something about these figures set off alarm bells in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those figures were aware of me, just as much as I was aware of them. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. But Reggie's low growl snapped me out of my thoughts. "Come on, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's head back to camp." We made our way back to the clearing, and I immediately set about moving my campsite. It wasn't that I was scared, at least. That's what I told myself, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a heavy fog. I found a new spot a little further up the lake, hidden by a thicket of trees that offered some cover. It wasn't as picturesque as the first spot, but it felt safer. As the sun began to set, I chopped some wood and got a fire going in the portable fire pit. The warmth was welcome as the temperature dropped, and I sat close to the flames, feeding Reggie before heating up a can of chili for myself. The night closed in around us, the darkness thick and impenetrable beyond the reach of the fire's glow. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the branches creak overhead. It was the kind of night where every sound seemed amplified, where the darkness played tricks on your eyes. I tried to relax, pulling out my journal to write down some thoughts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Reggie seemed to sense it too. He was on edge, his ears constantly swiveling toward the woods, his body tense. Every few minutes, he would growl softly, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the darkness. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Reggie didn't respond, just kept staring into the woods, his growl growing deeper. I set my journal aside, feeling my own anxiety rising. I hadn't seen or heard anything since those figures across the lake, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I decided to put out the fire, not wanting to advertise my location any more than necessary. The flames died down, leaving only the faint glow of embers, and the darkness pressed in around me like a living thing. I climbed into the tent, Reggie following close behind, and zipped it up tight. Inside, it was a small, comforting cocoon, the thin walls blocking out the vastness of the night. I tried to read, using a small lantern to light the pages of my book, but the words blurred together as my mind kept drifting back to those figures. Who were they? What were they doing in the woods so late in the day? And why did they make me feel so uneasy? I didn't have any answers, only the growing certainty that something was very wrong. Reggie's ears perked up again, and he started to growl, low and menacing. I froze, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind in the trees. But then, faintly, I heard it a whistle, high-pitched and clear, cutting through the night. It was the kind of whistle you'd use to call a dog, short and sharp. My heart skipped a beat. There shouldn't have been anyone out there, especially not at this hour. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The whistle came again, closer this time, followed by a series of clicking noises, like someone was making sounds with their tongue. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was no ordinary camper or hiker. Whoever was out there was deliberately trying to attract attention, to lure something or someone out of the safety of the tent. Reggie was growling louder now, his body rigid as he stared at the tent door. I felt a surge of fear, the primal kind that sends your heart racing and your mind into overdrive. I grabbed my flashlight and my axe, the only weapons I had, and moved closer to Reggie. "Stay quiet," I whispered to him, trying to keep my own voice steady. Don't make a sound. We sat there in the darkness, listening. The footsteps were soft, almost imperceptible, but I could hear them now, moving closer and closer to the tent. I tightened my grip on the axe, my palms sweating. Whoever was out there was playing a twisted game of cat and mouse, and I was the prey. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and for a moment, everything was still. The only sound was Reggie's growl, low and continuous, a warning that I wasn't alone. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to fight if I had to. Then, without warning, the tent zipper started to move. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it inched its way down, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I wait and see who or what was outside? Or should I attack first, take them by surprise? Before I could decide, the zipper stopped, halfway down. I could see a sliver of darkness through the gap, but nothing else. The whistling started again, softer this time, almost gentle, as if coaxing me to open the tent fully. It was a sound that sent chills down my spine, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged forward, yanking the zipper up with one hand while swinging the flashlight with the other, the beam slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just empty space, the woods silent and still. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I shone the flashlight around, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. Reggie was still growling, his gaze fixed on the trees just beyond the reach of the light. I felt a surge of relief, thinking that maybe whoever had been out there had run off when I opened the tent. But then I noticed something strange. The ground outside the tent was disturbed, the leaves and dirt scuffed as if something had been dragged across it. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight sweeping the area. There were faint tracks leading away from the tent, disappearing into the woods. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay put, to stay safe inside the tent. But curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks, Reggie at my side, his growl never wavering. The tracks led deeper into the woods, away from the campsite and the safety of the lake. The trees closed in around me, their branches forming a twisted canopy overhead. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. But I kept going, driven by a need to know what had been outside my tent. After what felt like hours, the tracks suddenly stopped. I looked around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just the silent trees, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see were shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, just the rustling growing louder, closer. I tightened my grip on the axe, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rustling stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was one of the figures I'd seen across the lake earlier, but now, up close, I could see them clearly. It was a man tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his thin frame like rags, and his skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. But it was his face that terrified me the most. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed, broken teeth. And his eyes, they were empty, void of any emotion, any humanity. He stared at me, unblinking, that twisted grin never faltering. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, grinning, his head tilted to the side as if he was studying me, like I was some kind of curiosity. Reggie was growling louder now, his body rigid with fear. "Stay back," I warned, raising the axe. But the man didn't move. He just kept grinning, that awful, hollow grin, as if he knew something I didn't. And then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with an unnatural speed that sent a wave of panic through me. I didn't wait to see where he was going. I turned and ran, Reggie at my side, my heart pounding as I tore through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I didn't stop until I reached the campsite, gasping for breath as I stumbled into the clearing. I quickly packed up my things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the tent poles apart. Reggie was barking now, sensing my fear, urging me to hurry. I didn't waste any time. Within minutes, I had everything packed and was making my way back to the truck, the darkness closing in around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, my mind conjuring images of that grinning man lurking in the shadows. When I finally reached the truck, I threw everything into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. Reggie leapt in after me, still barking. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road, away from the woods, away from that man. It wasn't until I was miles away, the woods far behind me, that I finally began to calm down. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Reggie had calmed down too, his barking replaced by a low whine as he curled up on the seat beside me. I sat there for a long time, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The figures across the lake, the man outside my tent, that awful twisted grin. I couldn't make sense of it. None of it seemed real, and yet I knew it was. I'd seen him, heard him, felt his presence in the darkness. I never went back to those woods. The memory of that night, of the man with the hollow eyes and twisted grin, haunted me for years. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to stumble into his domain. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in around me, I think I can hear it, the faint sound of whistling, drifting on the wind, calling out to me from the shadows. Story 3. The Silent Intruder. It was a rainy Saturday evening, the kind of night that presses down on you with a heavy, damp weight. The rain had started in the late afternoon and showed no signs of letting up, its steady rhythm against the windows creating a dull, monotonous backdrop. The sky was a murky shade of gray, the kind that seems to swallow any remaining daylight, plunging the world into an early, oppressive darkness. I was 20 years old, living at home while attending college, trying to balance the demands of school with the familiar comforts of family life. Our house was a split level, with my parents occupying the downstairs and my older brother, Alex, and I sharing the upstairs apartment. It was a cozy arrangement, the upstairs feeling like our own little world, separate from the rest of the house. We had our own kitchenette, a small living area, and 2 bedrooms. It was enough space for us to feel independent while still having the security of family close by. That night, my parents had gone to a party, leaving me home alone. Alex was supposed to be staying at a friend's house for the weekend, so I had the whole upstairs to myself. It was rare to have such solitude, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening of movies and snacks, cocooned in the warmth of my bed, while the rain fell steadily outside. I'd chosen Dr. Sleep, a Stephen King adaptation I'd been meaning to watch for a while. The dark, psychological horror seemed fitting for a night like this, where the outside world felt distant, and the only sounds were the patter of rain and the low hum of the heater. As I lay on my bed, the room bathed in the flickering light of the television. I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The tension in the movie was building, drawing me in, making me forget the world outside my cozy little space. But as the movie played on, a creeping unease began to worm its way into my mind. It started subtly, a feeling that something wasn't quite right, that the shadows in the room were a little too deep, the sounds a little too muffled. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the movie playing tricks on my imagination. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. About halfway through the movie, I paused it to grab another snack. The hallway outside my room was dimly lit, the overhead light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I walked to the kitchen, the wooden floorboards creaking softly under my feet. The house was old, and it had always made noises, groans, and sighs as it settled, the occasional creak as if someone had stepped just out of sight. Normally, these sounds were comforting, familiar reminders that the house was alive, that it had a presence of its own. But tonight, they felt different, more menacing somehow. As I reached for the pantry door, I heard a faint sound from downstairs, a door closing. The sound was so subtle that I almost missed it, barely audible over the rain. I froze, my hand hovering over the pantry handle, listening intently. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, like the soft click of a latch being set. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, or the house settling. But a nagging doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. I grabbed a box of crackers and headed back to my room, shutting the door behind me and turning the movie back on. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that sound, the soft click of a door closing. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more it nagged at me, growing louder in my memory. The backyard motion light flickered on as I was about to settle back into the story. The sudden illumination caught my eye, and I turned to look out the window. The light cast a harsh glow across the backyard, revealing nothing but the wet grass and the trees swaying in the wind. The yard looked empty, but the light unnerved me. It felt like something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching and waiting. I stared at the scene for a moment, waiting to see if anything would move, but the yard remained still. I turned back to the movie, telling myself it was probably just a stray animal or the wind triggering the sensor. But then, I heard it again, footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from directly below my room. My heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were faint, almost imperceptible over the sound of the rain, but they were there, a slow, steady rhythm that sent a chill down my spine. I quickly grabbed my phone and texted the family group chat. "Who just got home?" I typed, trying to keep my hands steady. My mom responded almost immediately. "We're not home, honey." Still at the party, a cold wave of fear washed over me. If it wasn't my parents, it had to be Alex. But he wasn't supposed to be home tonight. He'd told me he was staying at a friend's place for the weekend. I texted again. "Alex, is that you?" No reply. The footsteps continued, growing louder as they moved through the house. They weren't the casual steps of someone who belonged there, but the deliberate, almost hesitant movements of someone who didn't want to be heard, but wasn't quite succeeding. They stopped directly below my room. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The house had always been quiet, but tonight it was a silence that felt thick and oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I heard the creak of the stairs, the sound of weight being placed on the steps, one by one. Someone was coming up the stairs. I turned off the TV and plunged the room into darkness. My heart was pounding in my ears, the sound almost drowning out the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching my door. Whoever it was, they weren't in any hurry. It was as if they knew I was aware of them and were savoring the fear that must be radiating from me. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. The door handle turned slowly, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The only light in the room was from the faint glow of the TV, casting a dim, eerie light across the figure's face. I kept my eyes barely open, pretending to be asleep, hoping that whoever it was would leave if they thought I hadn't noticed them. But as I peered through my eyelashes, I could see the figure's eyes, dark and intent, staring straight at me. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching me, as if trying to decide what to do next. Every muscle in my body was tense, my mind racing with fear. Who was this person? What were they doing in my house? And why were they just standing there, silently watching me? The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like minutes. My thoughts were a chaotic jumble of terror and confusion. The figure's face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out the rough outline of a man. He was tall, his shoulders broad, his posture tense. His presence filled the room with a palpable sense of dread, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I could feel his eyes on me, tracking every slight movement I made, even the tiniest flutter of my eyelids. I tried to control my breathing, keeping it slow and steady, willing my body to remain still. But my mind was racing, desperate to understand what was happening. Why was he here? What did he want? The questions spiraled through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure stepped back and closed the door. But I didn't hear him walk away. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with fear. I waited, listening intently, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet of the house, as if it too were holding its breath. I slowly reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed a message in the family group chat. "Alex, please tell me that's you in the house." His reply came almost instantly, but it wasn't the reassurance I desperately needed. "No, what are you talking about?" Panic seized me. My worst fears were confirmed. There was a stranger in the house, and I was completely alone. I didn't dare move, terrified that the slightest sound would bring him back to my room. I quickly dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, as she instructed me to stay quiet and keep the line open. She asked if I could still hear the intruder, and I listened carefully, straining to catch any sound. And then, just as she asked, I heard the creak of a floorboard outside my room. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. The footsteps were moving again, but this time they were headed back down the stairs. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of someone moving around downstairs, the noise blending with the patter of rain against the windows. The dispatcher kept talking, asking if there were any weapons in the house, if I had any means of defending myself. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. I didn't have anything, no baseball bat, no heavy object to swing. Just a lamp on the nightstand, and that wouldn't do much good. The dispatcher assured me that the police were on their way, but I knew it would take them at least a few minutes to get here. Minutes that felt like an eternity when I didn't know what the intruder was planning. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door downstairs. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was, that the police had arrived and were at the door. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. What if the intruder was still in the house? What if he tried to escape, or worse? What if he decided to come after me before the police could reach him? I waited, every second feeling like a lifetime, until I heard the sound of the front door being opened. The dispatcher's voice reassured me that the officers were inside the house, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. I stayed on the line as the police searched the house, room by room, until they reached the upstairs. The officer knocked on my door, identifying himself, and I slowly opened it, my legs trembling as I stepped out. The sight of the uniformed officers brought a wave of relief that nearly overwhelmed me. They escorted me downstairs, where I was asked to sit on the couch while they finished clearing the house. I sat there, shaking as the officers continued their search. The house, which had always felt so familiar, now seemed alien, as if it belonged to someone else. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though the officers assured me the house was clear. After what felt like hours, the police finished their search. They hadn't found anyone, but they did discover that one of the back doors had been left unlocked. It was likely how the intruder had gotten in. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Had I forgotten to lock the door? Had I made it easy for this person to invade our home? The officers stayed with me until my parents arrived home. They were frantic with worry, their faces pale as they hugged me tightly. I could see the fear in their eyes, the fear that something terrible could have happened, that they could have lost me that night. They thanked the officers repeatedly, but I could tell that no amount of gratitude could ease the terror that still lingered in the air. That night, none of us slept. We huddled together in the living room, the lights on in every room of the house, as if the light could somehow ward off the darkness that had invaded our home. My dad double-checked every lock, every window, making sure that nothing had been left unsecured. But no matter how many precautions we took, the sense of safety we once had was shattered. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the intruder. Who was he? Why had he come into our house? What had he wanted? The police assured us that they were investigating, but I knew that finding answers wouldn't be easy. There were no fingerprints, no clear evidence to point to who this person was. It was as if he had slipped in and out of our lives like a ghost, leaving nothing behind but fear and questions. My brother Alex came home the next day, shaken by the news. He'd always been the protective older brother, the one who made sure I was safe. But now he looked at me with a mix of guilt and worry, as if he felt responsible for not being there when I needed him. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There wasn't much to say. The fear was something we all carried with us, unspoken but ever present. For weeks, I couldn't sleep in my room. The memory of that night, of the intruder standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me, haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I would lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, every sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me. Even the sound of rain against the windows, once comforting, now felt ominous, a reminder of the night when everything had changed. My parents tried to reassure me, telling me that the police were doing everything they could to find the intruder, that we were safe now. But I could see the strain in their faces, the way they jumped at small noises, the way they checked the locks over and over again. We were all living in fear, trapped by the memory of that night. Eventually, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy. I started sleeping in my room again, though I kept a bat under my bed, just in case. My parents went back to their routines, and Alex tried to act like everything was fine. But we all knew that things would never be the same. The intruder had taken more than just our sense of safety. He had taken our peace of mind. Months passed, and the investigation led nowhere. The police had no leads, no suspects. It was as if the intruder had simply vanished into thin air. The uncertainty was maddening, the not knowing who he was or what he had wanted. It left a wound that never fully healed, a scar that would always remind us of the night when a stranger walked into our home and turned our lives upside down. To this day, I still think about the intruder. Every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, Every time I see the motion light flicker on in the backyard, a part of me wonders if he's come back. I know it's irrational, that the chances of him returning are slim. But fear isn't always rational. It's a shadow that lingers, a dark presence that never truly leaves. And so, I live with that shadow, with the memory of the silent intruder who slipped into our home one rainy night and left us forever changed. But that's not where the story ends. One night, months after the incident, something happened that shook me to my core. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of a door creaking open. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened intently. It was the middle of the night, and everyone in the house was supposed to be asleep. I slowly got out of bed, grabbing the bat from under my bed, and crept toward the door. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost oppressive. I held my breath as I reached the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The hallway was empty, but the door to my parents' room was slightly ajar. I could see a sliver of darkness through the crack, but nothing else. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. My parents were sound asleep, their breathing steady and even. But something felt off, a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned my head to look. There in the corner, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was the same shadowy figure I had seen in my room that night, standing still, its eyes fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, the bat slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to break the spell, and the figure moved, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. Had it been real? Or was it just a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of my lingering fears? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, and closed the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, the bat clutched in my hands, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. The night passed slowly, the minutes dragging on like hours, but nothing happened. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, my body drained of all energy. I never told my parents about that night. They were already on edge, and I didn't want to add to their fears. But I knew that what I had seen was real. The figure, the intruder, was still out there, watching, waiting. And though the police never found him, I knew that he was still out there somewhere, slipping through the cracks of our lives, leaving nothing but fear and uncertainty in his wake. And every time I close my eyes, I see him, standing in the shadows, his eyes fixed on me, a silent reminder that the darkness is never far away. That night changed everything. It wasn't just about the fear of a stranger in our home. It was the fear that came from knowing that there are things in this world we can't explain, can't understand, and that sometimes those things slip into our lives without warning, leaving us forever changed. To this day, I still keep a bat under my bed, a small comfort in the face of an unknown threat. And every night, before I go to sleep, I check the locks on every door, every window, making sure that the darkness stays outside where it belongs. But deep down, I know that the darkness isn't just outside. It's inside too, a part of me now, a shadow that I carry with me everywhere I go. And no matter how hard I try, I can't escape it. Because the silent intruder didn't just slip into our home that night. He slipped into our lives, into our minds, and he's never really left. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.